The morning sun cast golden rays through the towering stained glass windows of Westminster Cathedral as thousands of guests filled every seat for the most anticipated coronation in decades. Prince Alexander stood in his private chamber, adjusting his ceremonial uniform one final time. His hands trembled slightly, not from nerves about the ceremony, but from the weight of a secret he had carried for months. Outside, millions of people lined the streets of London, their faces painted with flags and their voices joining in songs of celebration. Television crews from around the world had positioned their cameras at every angle, ready to capture every moment of this historic day. The air buzzed with excitement as the nation prepared to witness their beloved prince take his place in the royal succession. Alexander's personal aide, James, knocked gently on the door. "Your Highness, it's time," he said softly. The prince nodded, taking one last look at himself in the ornate mirror. He thought about his late mother, Queen Isabella, who had passed away just 6 months earlier. She had always told him that true leadership came not from wearing a crown, but from showing genuine love for his people. As Alexander made his way through the ancient corridors of the cathedral, he could hear the magnificent organ playing the traditional processional hymn. Each step echoed against the stone walls, a sound that seemed to carry the weight of centuries of royal tradition. The Archbishop of Canterbury waited at the altar, holding the ceremonial crown that would soon rest upon Alexander's head. The massive wooden doors opened and Alexander stepped into the nave. The sight that greeted him was breathtaking. Thousands of people rose to their feet in unison, their voices creating a thunderous wave of applause that seemed to shake the very foundations of the cathedral. Dignitaries from every corner of the globe had traveled to witness this moment, their formal attire creating a sea of elegant colors throughout the ancient hall. Television cameras captured every expression on Alexander's face as he walked slowly down the aisle. Commentators whispered reverently about the significance of this moment, describing the intricate details of his ceremonial robes and the historical importance of each ritual element. Around the world, families gathered in their living rooms, completely captivated by the pageantry and tradition unfolding before their eyes. But as Alexander approached the altar, something unexpected began to stir within him. The faces in the crowd weren't just those of nobles and politicians. Scattered throughout the congregation, he spotted ordinary citizens who had been selected through a national lottery to attend this historic ceremony. There was Mrs. Henderson, an elderly teacher who had dedicated her life to educating children in underprivileged communities. Near her sat Marcus, a young firefighter who had saved dozens of lives during the previous year's devastating floods. The prince's eyes continued to scan the crowd, and with each familiar face he recognized, his composure began to waver. These weren't just subjects of the crown. They were real people with real stories, real struggles, and real dreams. They had put their faith in him, believing that he would serve them with honor and dedication. The magnitude of this responsibility settled upon his shoulders like a heavy cloak. As the ceremony progressed through its ancient rituals, Alexander found himself thinking about all the conversations he had shared with his mother during her final weeks. She had spoken passionately about the importance of connecting with people on a human level, of showing vulnerability when appropriate, and of never forgetting that beneath the crown and titles, he was simply a man called to serve others. Archbishop began the formal invocation, his voice carrying clearly throughout the cathedral and into homes across the nation. Alexander knelt at the altar, feeling the cool stone beneath his knees and the weight of history pressing down upon him. This was the moment he had prepared for his entire life, yet nothing could have truly prepared him for the overwhelming surge of emotion that was beginning to build within his chest. Television viewers around the world leaned forward in their chairs, sensing that something profound was about to happen. The usual stoic composure that the royal family was known for seemed to be giving way to something much more human and authentic. In living rooms across the kingdom, people found themselves holding their breath, completely absorbed in this unfolding moment of history. The ceremony continued with its time-honored traditions, but everyone present could sense that this coronation would be remembered not just for its grandeur, but for the unexpected emotional journey that was about to unfold. Alexander closed his eyes for a moment, drawing strength from the memory of his mother's final words to him. "Let them see your heart, my son. That is where true leadership begins." The archbishop raised the ancient ceremonial oil, its golden container catching the light from hundreds of candles that flickered throughout the cathedral. This sacred anointing had been performed for over 1,000 years, connecting Alexander to an unbroken chain of monarchs who had knelt in this very spot. As the holy oil touched his forehead, Alexander felt a profound connection to something much larger than himself. In the front row, his younger sister, Princess Charlotte, watched with tears already forming in her eyes. She knew better than anyone the burden their mother's death had placed on Alexander's shoulders. For months, she had watched him struggle with grief, while simultaneously preparing to take on responsibilities that would change his life forever. She had seen him in private moments, when the weight of expectation seemed almost too much to bear. The television cameras zoomed in on Alexander's face as the anointing continued. Viewers around the world could see something shifting in his expression. The formal mask that royals typically wore during ceremonies was beginning to crack, revealing glimpses of genuine emotion beneath. Social media exploded with comments from people who had never seen such authentic feeling from a member of the royal family during an official ceremony. Queen Margaret, Alexander's grandmother, sat regally in her designated seat, but even she seemed moved by the intensity of the moment. At 93 years old, she had witnessed countless royal ceremonies, but something about this particular coronation felt different. There was an energy in the cathedral that she had never experienced before, a sense that history was being made not just through tradition, but through genuine human connection. As the archbishop began the prayer of consecration, Alexander's mind wandered to a conversation he had shared with a young girl named Emma just weeks earlier during a hospital visit. She had been battling leukemia for 2 years, and her bright smile, despite her circumstances, had touched him deeply. "Will you remember us little people when you're wearing your crown?" she had asked innocently. Her question had haunted him ever since. The congregation remained silent, but the atmosphere was electric with anticipation. Even the most seasoned royal correspondents seemed unusually affected by the ceremony. Lady Catherine Morrison, who had covered royal events for 30 years, found herself wiping away tears as she watched Alexander's visible struggle to maintain his composure. Throughout the cathedral, ordinary citizens who had won the lottery to attend found themselves leaning forward in their seats. Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, who ran a small bakery in Yorkshire, had never imagined they would witness such a raw, human moment during what they expected to be a formal, distant ceremony. Their own eyes began to moisten as they watched the prince's internal battle play out before thousands of onlookers. The archbishop's voice grew stronger as he reached the most sacred part of the ceremony. "Will you solemnly promise and swear to govern the people of this kingdom according to their respective laws and customs?" The traditional words had been spoken countless times before, but today they seemed to carry extra weight, extra meaning. Alexander's voice caught slightly as he responded, "I solemnly promise so to do." The slight crack in his voice was picked up by every microphone in the cathedral and transmitted to millions of homes around the world. In that moment, something extraordinary happened. Instead of appearing weak or unprepared, Alexander's vulnerability made him seem more relatable, more human than any royal had ever appeared during such a formal ceremony. Back in the television studios, seasoned commentators found themselves at a loss for words. This wasn't following the script of typical royal ceremonies. Dame Elizabeth Hartwell, the BBC's royal correspondent for over 4 decades, leaned into her microphone and whispered, "In all my years of covering royal events, I have never witnessed anything quite like this. There is something profoundly moving happening in that cathedral today." The moment the archbishop lifted the St. Edward's crown, a hush fell over the entire congregation that seemed to extend beyond the cathedral walls and into the streets where millions more people watched on giant screens. This was it, the moment when Alexander would officially become heir to the throne. But as the crown approached his head, something unexpected happened that would change everything. Alexander looked up from his kneeling position, and his eyes found his sister Charlotte in the front row. She smiled at him through her own tears and mouthed the words their mother used to say to them as children. "Be brave, be kind, be true." That simple gesture, that connection to his family and his mother's memory, finally broke through all of his careful composure. The cameras captured every detail as Alexander's shoulders began to shake slightly. The archbishop paused, uncertain whether to continue, but Alexander nodded for him to proceed. As the crown was placed upon his head, tears began to flow down the new prince's cheeks. Not tears of sadness, but tears of overwhelming gratitude and responsibility. The silence in the cathedral was deafening. No one moved. No one spoke. Everyone present realized they were witnessing something extraordinary. A royal ceremony transformed into a moment of pure, authentic human emotion that would be remembered for generations to come. The weight of the crown settled upon Alexander's head, and with it came a flood of memories that he had tried to keep contained throughout the ceremony. He saw his mother's face during her final weeks, when she had called him to her bedside and spoken about the true meaning of service. She had told him about the lonely nights when she questioned her decisions, the constant pressure of being watched by millions, and the incredible privilege of being trusted with people's hopes and dreams. Throughout the cathedral, something magical began to happen. What started as one person's emotional breakthrough began to ripple outward, like waves in a pond. Princess Charlotte was no longer trying to hide her own tears, and soon other members of the royal family found themselves equally moved. Prince Henry, Alexander's uncle, who was known for his stoic military bearing, felt his own eyes beginning to well up as he watched his nephew's authentic response to this life-changing moment. The archbishop, a man who had performed countless ceremonies with practiced precision, found himself pausing longer than protocol dictated. Even he seemed affected by the profound emotion filling the ancient cathedral. His own voice carried a deeper warmth than usual as he continued with the traditional words that would formally recognize Alexander's new position. In homes across the nation, families gathered around television sets found themselves equally moved. The Johnson family in Manchester sat transfixed as they watched the ceremony unfold. 8-year-old Sophie tugged on her mother's sleeve and whispered, "Mommy, why is the prince crying? Is he sad?" Her mother, herself wiping away tears, explained, gently, "No, sweetheart, sometimes we cry when we feel very happy and grateful at the same time." The moment became even more powerful when Alexander, still kneeling with tears streaming down his face, began to speak words that were not part of the traditional ceremony. His voice was barely above a whisper, but the cathedral's acoustics carried his words to every corner of the vast space. "I promise to serve you with my whole heart," he said, his voice trembling with emotion. "I promise to never forget that you have trusted me with something precious, your faith in the future." These unscripted words sent a shockwave through the congregation. Royal ceremonies were carefully planned and rehearsed, with every word and gesture predetermined. But Alexander's spontaneous promise came directly from his heart, and everyone present could feel the sincerity behind each word. The formal distance that typically existed between the royal family and their subjects seemed to dissolve in that moment. Queen Margaret, despite her decades of training in royal composure, felt tears forming in her own eyes. She had worried about Alexander's readiness for this role, especially so soon after his mother's death. But watching him now, seeing his genuine emotion and authentic connection to the responsibility he was accepting, she realized that his heart was perhaps his greatest qualification for leadership. The television cameras continued to capture every angle of this unprecedented moment. In the BBC studios, royal expert Professor James Mitchell adjusted his glasses and leaned toward the microphone. What we are witnessing today is perhaps the most authentic moment in royal ceremony history. This is not weakness we're seeing from the prince. This is the strength that comes from genuine care for others. Back in the cathedral, the congregation began to respond to Alexander's emotion in their own ways. Mrs. Henderson, the retired teacher in the fifth row, found herself thinking about all the children she had taught over the years and how they had looked up to her for guidance and support. She understood the weight of responsibility that Alexander was feeling because she had experienced it herself on a smaller scale. Marcus, the young firefighter, remembered the fear and determination he felt every time he responded to an emergency call, knowing that people were depending on him to help them in their worst moments. Seeing Alexander's emotional response to accepting responsibility for an entire nation resonated deeply with his own experiences of service. Throughout the cathedral, similar connections were being made. People from all walks of life found themselves relating to Alexander's emotion because they recognized the universal human experience of feeling overwhelmed by responsibility while simultaneously being honored to serve others. The formal barriers that typically separated royalty from ordinary citizens began to feel less significant. The Archbishop, recognizing the profound nature of this moment, made his own departure from tradition. Instead of immediately continuing with the next part of the ceremony, he placed a gentle hand on Alexander's shoulder and said, "Take your time, Your Highness. This is your moment." The kindness and understanding in his voice seemed to give Alexander permission to fully experience his emotions rather than rushing to compose himself. As Alexander knelt there, crowned but still overwhelmed, he felt a sense of connection to every person in the cathedral and beyond. He thought about the farmer in Scotland who had sent him a letter about struggling to keep his family farm running. He remembered the single mother in Wales who had thanked him for visiting her community center. He pictured the elderly veteran who had shared stories about serving his country with pride despite the hardships. All of these faces, all of these stories seemed to converge in this single moment. Alexander realized that wearing the crown wasn't about being elevated above others, but about being entrusted with their hopes, their challenges, and their dreams for the future. The tears continued to flow as this understanding deepened and, with each tear, his connection to his future subjects grew stronger. As Alexander finally rose to his feet, still wearing the ancient crown and wiping tears from his cheeks, something unprecedented happened in the cathedral. One person began to clap, then another. Soon, the entire congregation was on their feet, applauding not the ceremony or the tradition, but the man who had just shown them his heart so openly and honestly. The sound of applause in a royal coronation ceremony was unheard of, but protocol seemed less important than the genuine connection that had formed between Alexander and everyone present. The Archbishop smiled, understanding that sometimes the most sacred moments happen when we step outside the boundaries of tradition and allow authentic human emotion to take center stage. Alexander looked out over the sea of faces, all of them, showing various degrees of emotion. In the diplomatic section, even the most reserved foreign dignitaries seemed moved by what they had witnessed. The French ambassador, known for his formal demeanor, was wiping his own eyes. The German chancellor, typically stoic in public appearances, was applauding with genuine enthusiasm. Princess Charlotte rose from her seat and walked toward her brother, another break from traditional protocol. As she reached him, she took his hands in hers and whispered, "Mother would be so proud of you right now. This is exactly what she meant when she said to lead with your heart." Her words gave Alexander the strength he needed to continue with the ceremony while maintaining the authentic connection he had forged with everyone present. The moment took on even greater significance when Alexander turned to address the congregation. Directly, again departing from the scripted ceremony, his voice, though still emotional, carried a new strength and clarity. "Thank you," he said simply, "for allowing me to be human in this moment. Thank you for trusting me not just with a title, but with your hopes for our future together." Around the world, television audiences were experiencing something they had never seen before in a royal ceremony. Social media platforms exploded with messages of support and admiration. Authentic leadership began trending worldwide as people shared their own stories of being moved by Alexander's display of genuine emotion. Many commented that they had never felt more connected to the royal family than they did in this moment. In a small apartment in London, elderly Mrs. Grace Wilson watched the ceremony alone, having lost her husband just months before. When she saw Alexander's tears, she felt less alone in her own grief. "He understands," she whispered to herself. "He really understands what it means to lose someone you love and still have to keep going." Her own tears mixed with a sense of comfort that she hadn't expected to find. Back in the cathedral, the ceremony continued, but with a completely different energy than anyone had anticipated. Each ritual element seemed to carry deeper meaning, now that the emotional barriers had been broken down. When Alexander received the ceremonial sword, symbolizing his duty to protect his people, he held it with visible reverence for the responsibility it represented. The congregation remained unusually engaged throughout the remainder of the ceremony. Instead of the typical formal distance between participants and observers, everyone seemed to be sharing in the experience together. When the choir sang the traditional hymns, voices from the congregation joined in with more enthusiasm and emotion than had ever been recorded at a royal ceremony. Queen Margaret watched her grandson with a mixture of pride and amazement. In all her years of royal training and ceremony participation, she had been taught that emotional restraint was essential to maintaining royal dignity. But watching Alexander's authentic response and seeing how it brought everyone together, she began to question whether that old approach had actually created unnecessary distance between the royal family and the people they served. The Archbishop, nearing the end of the ceremony, seemed inspired by the emotional authenticity that had transformed the entire event. Instead of rushing through the final elements, he took time to speak about the significance of each tradition, helping everyone present understand the deeper meaning behind rituals that might otherwise seem merely ceremonial. As the ceremony approached its conclusion, Alexander prepared to take the final oath of service. But before speaking the traditional words, he paused and looked directly into the television cameras, knowing that millions of people around the world were watching. What he said next would become one of the most quoted speeches in royal history. "Today, I have learned something profound about leadership," he began, his voice steady but still carrying the emotional depth from earlier. "I have learned that strength does not come from hiding our feelings, but from sharing them honestly. I have learned that connection happens not when we pretend to be perfect, but when we allow others to see our humanity." The cathedral fell completely silent as Alexander continued. "I promise you that I will lead not from a place of superiority, but from a place of service. I will remember this moment, when you allowed me to be real with you, and I will carry that trust with me in everything I do. We are not subjects and ruler. We are people who care about each other and about building a future we can all be proud of." The words resonated throughout the cathedral and into homes around the world. This was not the language typically used in royal ceremonies, but it felt more meaningful and relevant than any traditional speech could have been. Alexander had transformed not just his own understanding of leadership, but everyone's understanding of what it meant to serve others with authentic care and genuine commitment. The final blessing was delivered with unusual warmth by the Archbishop, who seemed as moved as everyone else by the transformed atmosphere in the cathedral. As he spoke the ancient words of benediction, his voice carried a genuine hope and excitement for the kind of leadership Alexander had just promised to provide. The traditional ceremony was coming to an end, but everyone present sensed that something entirely new was beginning. As Alexander prepared to process back down the aisle, now officially crowned and recognized in his new role, the congregation remained standing. But instead of the formal, respectful silence that typically accompanied such moments, people began to smile and nod at him as he passed. Some even reached out to touch his hand or offer words of encouragement, creating an unprecedented level of personal connection during what was supposed to be a formal ceremonial exit. The walk back down the aisle took much longer than planned, because Alexander stopped frequently to acknowledge individuals in the crowd. He paused to speak with Mrs. Henderson, the retired teacher, thanking her for her decades of service to children. He shook hands with Marcus, the firefighter, and told him how much he admired his courage. These personal interactions, captured by television cameras, showed a side of royal duty that had rarely been seen in such formal settings. Outside the cathedral, the crowds that had gathered to watch the ceremony on large screens had been following every moment of Alexander's emotional journey. When the cathedral doors opened and he emerged, still wearing the crown but with tear-stained cheeks, the response from the thousands of people lining the streets was unlike anything London had ever experienced during a royal event. Instead of the typical formal cheering and flag-waving, people began calling out personal messages of support and encouragement. "Thank you for being real with us," shouted one woman. "We love you for showing your heart," called out a young man. The atmosphere felt more like a community celebration than a formal royal procession. Alexander's carriage ride back to the palace became an extension of the emotional connection that had been forged in the cathedral. He waved to the crowds with genuine warmth, occasionally wiping away tears that continued to flow as he saw the faces of people who had trusted him with their hopes and dreams. The formal distance that typically existed between royalty and citizens seemed to have dissolved completely. Princess Charlotte, riding in the carriage behind her brother, watched in amazement as people responded to Alexander's authenticity with their own openness. Children held up homemade signs with messages like, "Thank you for caring about us," and "You made us cry happy tears too." Even adults who had come expecting a traditional ceremony seemed transformed by the experience they had shared. Television coverage of the procession captured moments that would be replayed for years to come. When Alexander's carriage paused at a crossing, an elderly man in a wheelchair managed to get close enough to the carriage to speak directly to the new prince. "Your mother would be proud," he said simply. Alexander's response, climbing down from the carriage to shake the man's hand and thank him for his words, created an image that symbolized the new kind of leadership he had promised. Back at the palace, staff members who had been watching the ceremony on television were unprepared for the emotional energy that Alexander brought with him when he returned. Instead of the typical formal debriefing that followed royal ceremonies, Alexander spent time talking with everyone present, from senior advisors to kitchen staff, about what the day had meant to him and how it had changed his understanding of his role. The immediate aftermath of the ceremony saw an unprecedented response from the public. The palace switchboard was flooded with calls from people wanting to share how moved they had been by Alexander's authentic emotion. Letters and messages poured in from around the world, with many people describing how his vulnerability had inspired them to be more open and honest in their own lives. Social media platforms experienced a phenomenon that royal watchers had never seen before. Instead of the typical mixture of praise and criticism that usually followed royal events, there was an overwhelming wave of positive response focused specifically on Alexander's authenticity and emotional honesty. The hashtag #OurRealLeadership spread across multiple platforms as people shared stories of leaders in their own lives who had shown similar courage in being vulnerable. news organizations around the world struggled to find precedents for what had happened during the ceremony. Royal correspondents who had covered dozens of similar events found themselves at a loss for comparison. The emotional authenticity that Alexander had displayed and the way it had transformed the entire ceremony represented something entirely new in the history of royal public appearances. International leaders began responding to the ceremony with their own expressions of admiration for Alexander's approach. The President of Ireland issued a statement praising the courage it takes to lead with both strength and vulnerability. The Prime Minister of Canada commented on how authentic emotion can bridge any divide between leaders and the people they serve. As evening fell on Coronation Day, Alexander sat in his private chambers, still wearing portions of his ceremonial dress, but having removed the crown. He reflected on how different the day had been from what he had expected. The ceremony had become something far more meaningful than he had imagined possible, not because of its traditions and pageantry, but because of the human connections that had been forged through shared emotion and authentic vulnerability. The day had proven that true leadership doesn't require maintaining distance from others, but rather creating genuine connections based on honesty, empathy, and shared humanity. Alexander realized that his tears had not weakened his position as a leader, but had actually strengthened the bond between him and the people he was called to serve. 6 months later, the impact of Alexander's emotional coronation continued to ripple through society in ways no one had anticipated. The authenticity he had displayed that day had fundamentally changed how people viewed leadership, not just in the royal family, but in their own communities, workplaces, and families. Schools began teaching lessons about authentic leadership, using Alexander's ceremony as an example of how showing genuine emotion could actually strengthen rather than weaken a leader's effectiveness. The changes were visible in Alexander's approach to his royal duties. Instead of maintaining the traditional formal distance during public appearances, he made genuine connections with people everywhere he went. During hospital visits, he spent extra time listening to patients and their families, often sharing tears with them during difficult moments. His willingness to show emotion created safe spaces for others to express their own feelings without shame. Mrs. Henderson, the retired teacher who had attended the coronation, started a community program called Leading with Heart in her local area. Inspired by Alexander's example, she encouraged young people to embrace both strength and vulnerability in their own leadership roles. The program spread to dozens of communities across the country, with participants often referencing the coronation as the moment they realized that authentic emotion was a leadership strength, not a weakness. Marcus, the firefighter who had also witnessed the ceremony, found that Alexander's example influenced his approach to his own work. He began talking more openly with his fellow firefighters about the emotional toll of their job, creating support systems that had never existed before. The fire department saw a significant decrease in stress-related issues among its personnel as they followed Marcus's lead in embracing emotional honesty. The royal family itself underwent subtle but significant changes following the coronation. Queen Margaret, inspired by her grandson's courage, began incorporating more personal touches into her own public appearances. She started sharing stories about her own challenges and experiences, creating deeper connections with people she met. The entire royal family seemed to embrace a new understanding that their role was not to be untouchable figures on pedestals, but accessible examples of service and humanity. International leaders began adopting similar approaches in their own countries. The President of France cited Alexander's coronation in a speech about the importance of leaders showing genuine care for their citizens. Political science professors around the world added the ceremony to their curricula as an example of how authenticity could transform the relationship between leaders and those they serve. The media coverage of royal events changed permanently after the coronation. Instead of focusing primarily on fashion choices and protocol adherence, Journalists began looking for and reporting on moments of genuine human connection. The public's appetite for authentic emotion from their leaders had increased dramatically, leading to more meaningful and substantial coverage of public service. Alexander's approach to addressing national challenges was also transformed by the emotional breakthrough of his Coronation Day. When the country faced a severe economic crisis 8 months later, instead of delivering a detached, formal address, Alexander spoke directly to the nation about his own concerns and fears while simultaneously expressing confidence in their collective ability to overcome difficulties. His honest acknowledgement of the challenges, combined with genuine optimism about solutions, helped unite the country during a difficult time. The anniversary of the coronation became known as Authentic Leadership Day, with communities across the nation holding events focused on celebrating leaders who showed both strength and vulnerability. Children in schools learned about the importance of being honest about their feelings while still being brave enough to help others. The day had become a national reminder that true strength comes not from hiding emotions, but from using them to create genuine connections with others. Alexander often reflected on how a single moment of authentic emotion had transformed not only his own understanding of leadership, but had somehow given permission to an entire society to embrace a more honest and connected way of relating to one another. He realized that his tears had not been a sign of weakness or unpreparedness, but rather the beginning of a new kind of leadership that prioritized human connection over formal distance. Years later, when young people asked Alexander about the secret to effective leadership, he always returned to the lesson he learned during his coronation. The moment you allow others to see your heart, he would tell them, is the moment you become truly capable of touching theirs. Leadership isn't about being perfect or untouchable. It's about being brave enough to care openly and honestly about the people you serve. The coronation had indeed brought millions to tears, but those tears had watered the seeds of a more compassionate, connected, and authentic approach to leadership that continued to grow and flourish long after that extraordinary day in Westminster Cathedral. Alexander's unexpected emotional moment had proven that sometimes the most powerful thing a leader can do is simply allow others to see their humanity, creating space for genuine connection and mutual understanding that transcends traditional boundaries between those who lead and those who are served. The legacy of that tearful coronation day lived on in countless acts of authentic leadership, honest communication, and genuine care that rippled through society, proving that one person's courage to be vulnerable can inspire an entire nation to embrace a more connected and compassionate way of living together.